It's an honor for me to introduce our next two plenary speakers, Asmaa and Hansa AbuMezied. These ladies have come all the way to us from Palestine, from the Gaza Strip, and it's been a hell of a journey to get here. They'll be talking on the topic education, English, and the question of the future in conflict areas. Asmaa, who will be opening up the talk, is a woman economic justice advisor working in the Gaza, and she works on issues related to economic justice, climate change, and identity. Hansa works as an English teacher in a public school in a really marginalized area in the Gaza. She's also an English trainer for adults. In 2016, Hansa received a Fulbright Distinguished Award in Teaching. And in 2017, she was one of the most distinguished teachers in the Gaza Strip. These two ladies come with a lot of experience, but also with a lot of research. And they would be sharing with us their thoughts on this theme today. So can I invite you up, Asmaa?
Thank you, Harry. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I know today is the last day, and I hope that the energy that you have today is the same as the energy you started with. And we take that passion and learning and experience back home with us. As Harry mentioned, Hansa and I will be speaking today about education, English, and the question of future in conflict areas. And I want to ask everyone here, please raise your hand if you know about a conflict in the whole world. Just raise your hand. That's good. Please raise your hand if you know about the total number of conflict that is currently happening around the world. Don't worry, today we will help you having this information, and we hope that you will take this information back home with you to think about it and to see what can we do together. Now, the number of conflicts around the world, according to the Council on Foreign Relations, that does a global conflict trackers, is 27 conflicts happening in almost all the continents around the world. In the Latin Americas, in Northern America, but also in Africa, Asia, and Europe. And if you can see in the board, most of these conflicts are happening in Africa, in Middle East, and in Asia. Now, these conflicts vary, and the causes of these conflicts vary. You have civil war, like in the example of Syria and Ethiopia. You have political and economic instability, like in the case of Lebanon, Egypt. And you also have interstate conflicts, like what we are witnessing with Russia and Ukraine, the US and Iran. And we also have so much conflict that is happening in countries like Mexico, where there is a criminal violence and like militias happening on the ground. And also what we have been seeing over the past few years is that so much social injustices happening in every country around the world almost, and people are protesting to demand for more social justice. And the last type of conflict is conflict for territorial dispute. That's what, it's called. And where I come from is one of these areas that is suffering from that conflict. Now, although over the past decades, we have seen less number of people being killed due to conflict, but we are seeing an increase in the number of conflicts that is happening around the world. And the unfortunate news that this number is more likely to increase as we are suffering from climate change, and decreasing natural resources. So the more that we are losing our natural resources, the more we are being extracted and extractive to our planet, the more it's likely to have conflicts around the world. And how that leaves us is a big question for us in today's conference. That leaves so many people, conflict leaves so many people living in these areas. And the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has said in March 22 that as we meet today, 1/4 of humanity live in conflict-affected areas. This is 2 billion people, not 1 million, not 100, it's 2 billion people. 2 billion people, some of them are refugees, some of them are internally displaced, some of them are living in the most marginalized area, even in the most developed countries around the world. And all of us, 1/4 of the humanity, are suffering from the consequences of this conflict. And one thing to note is that conflict is not in the state of active bombardment and active airstrikes. Conflict never leaves you even when it ends. And that's what we are talking about when we think about future of education and future generation. So those who are living in a conflict area, they end up in a state of survival rather than like living. Living is a word that does not mean anything because they are constantly on the lock, constantly looking behind their back, constantly looking up to the sky. And the main goal and purpose is how to live another day. How can we support our family to live another day? So in that state of survival, where Hasna and I come from, are a place that lives that kind of survival, is a place called Gaza. The UN has called Gaza unlivable by 2020, although we are still alive, although we are here with you today, but we are not living, to be honest. We are just surviving, counting our breath in and out. And I'll just give a brief about Gaza. Gaza is you always see it in the news. You know, it makes the headline. It's noisy for so many out there. It's a very tiny place. It's 365 square kilometers, yet it's considered one of the mostly dense populated areas with 2 million people living in this tiny place. And Gaza have been going through occupation for decades. It has been going through a blockade for the past 15 years. Actually, June the 5th will be the anniversary of 15 years of the blockade. And it is considered an open-air prison. And if you're wondering how it's a prison while Hasna and I are here, then we will have to have another conversation about the journey that takes people from Gaza to reach and to leave and come back. But that's not the state of Gaza only. If you look around the room, and if you identify a person from the 27 areas that is being affected by conflict, please take the time and ask them, what did it take for them to come here? What was the journey? And ask them about their colleagues who were not able to attend, because that's another story. We are privileged to be here, but others were not able to come. So in Gaza, as I mentioned, we have blockade, we have also occupation, but we also had to go through like 4 aggressions over the past 15 years. And each aggression is leaving us more fragile than ever. Each aggression leaves us thinking that death actually is the best way out, because what kind of future are we building for our children? How can we provide them with a future when all we think about is that state of being in constant fear, that state of surviving? And that's not a future that you want to give to your children. Now, a few background also on Gaza. Gaza is a place that is living on humanitarian assistance. 65% of the population is living in a humanitarian assistance, according to the UN Office for Coordination for Humanitarian Action. About half of the population is unemployed. So like you get educated, you like put so much investment, social and financial investment to get educated, to graduate, but then like 50%, almost 50% is unemployed. Also, 53% of the population is living in poverty. So it gives you an indication how much families, parents, are sacrificing to get their children, while they are living in a state of poverty, to have an education. And also, according to the World Food Program, 64% of the population is food insecure. And most of these people are adopting a negative coping mechanism, eating food that is not healthy, eating food that affects their physical growth, that mental growth, and like what kind of living that they give for their children. And lastly, Gaza was called unlivable because 96% of the water that is important for basic human needs is undrinkable. And we are more likely to have this percentage increase over the coming years. These are images from Gaza. As you can see, this very crowded picture is the picture of people during summer where they go to the sea, the only outlet that we have. And like you'll find that 2 million people out there in the sea trying to enjoy that kind of breeze. And this is a picture from 2019. I mentioned that there are 4 major aggressions that Gaza has gone through. But that does not mean that during the year, all over the year, there wasn't any bombardment or any airstrike. Almost every month, we have to go through an airstrike somewhere across the Gaza Strip. People have to experience the loss of their hard labor, the loss of their homes, their memories where they first met their loved ones, or like had their children, walking and doing the first walk. And that's something that misses your mind every single day because that feeling of safety and security is not there. But for Palestinians, to navigate that, education is a fundamental area that they focus on. I remember my grandparents pushing my dad to continue his education, to travel abroad, to have an income, because we understand that without education, we will not be heard. We understand that education is a fundamental right for us, but it's also a way of surviving, a way of living. And with that, I will leave the space to Hasna, who will tell us about the journey of an English language teacher working in Gaza.
So, hello everyone, my name is Hasna, and it is a pleasure to be here among all these fabulous educators. I have learned a lot during the past few days, and I'm looking forward to learn more and more. So, what shapes the journey of a Palestinian English language teacher in Gaza? We all know that teachers are indispensable for the success of the learning process. Among them, Palestinian teachers who face a lot of challenges while teaching in a conflict-affected area. So, I will focus on educational, political, and economic challenges that we face on a daily basis. What does a person like me, a female English language teacher, face on a daily basis by multi-layered circumstances? Let's start with educational challenges. The first one that I'm going to talk about, and on the top of my list, is limited numbers of schools per capita. We all know that schools are the place where students should feel secure. They should feel protected. It is the place that they meet their friends, plan their futures. But one of the major problems in Gaza Strip that we don't have enough schools. And that's due to the high population and the frequent damaging of schools, which led to overcrowded classes, reached to 50 students in the class. I remember in the first 3 years I worked as a teacher, I had 60 female students in the class. Teachers try to use active learning techniques. They spend more time, more efforts to engage students, but unfortunately, most of the time it will end with chaos and noise. According to Kishta, 45 to 50 is the standard size of Palestinian classes, which prevent students from decent education and attention. And as a result of overcrowded classes, schools started working and operating on double or triple shifts. According to OCHA, 63% of public schools and 70% of UNRWA schools work on double or triple shifts, which cause overcrowded classes and less hours of the educational process. Another major factor is limited resources, including technology. In some areas, teachers have to buy the chalk with them, especially if they are going to use colored chalk. And when we talk about technology, yes, teachers try to use interactive methods in teaching. But when you think about it, using interactive methods in teaching but not having enough resources related to technology is an obstacle. For example, in my school, we have 2 rooms that are prepared with LCDs, the library and the computer lab. So if I wanted to show my student a documentary, a PowerPoint, I have to coordinate with other teachers to make it possible. I know this is a common problem in many areas around the world, but what makes it more difficult is in Gaza is that we have a shortage of electricity. We have from 6 to 12 hours of electricity a day. We have something called a electricity schedule. It is a schedule that informs you how many hours electricity you will get. Is it in the morning or in the evening? Is there extra cuts or not? So it is not only that I have to coordinate with other teachers to make it possible, but I have to keep checking electricity schedule. So sometimes I will tell my students of a date of exam, and they will ask me to postpone it according to the electricity schedule because it is different from one area to another. And of course I will do that because if I didn't, my students will be studying like that boy. And when it comes to teaching and when it comes to electricity in general, also according to OCHA, the constant shortfall of electricity plays a major role in restricting students' learning and their study time. And not only that, but when you think about it, we have, as Asmaa said, political instability, which comes, of course, to your mind when we talk about Gaza Strip. And with political instability, of course, comes a blockade and restrictions of people's movement. So how does that affect education? How does that affect English teaching? First of all, it will cause limited opportunities of teaching English in real life. There is no tourist. There is limited contact with foreigners. Our students always feel frustrated and disconnected from English language. They will always ask you a question. I will never be able to travel outside Gaza, so why should I study English in the first place? And that's normal when you think, or you believe, that Gaza lives in a forced immobility. According to Geisha, and Geisha is an Israeli human rights organization, says that Gaza Strip has been isolated since 1990s, and there is a limited movement between Gaza and West Bank, as well as Gaza and abroad. And what comes also with political instability, a disruption of education for teachers and students in many ways. Throughout the 14 years I have been teaching English language, there has been a disruption every year. I mean, literally every year. So that's puts a great pressure on teachers to try to finish the curriculum. It increases the workload of teachers, which means, for example, to deliver 4 months' content into 3 months' content. And thus, it means that teachers will take extra classes to meet the tight question, forsaking, for example, art and BE classes, which are instrumental for childhood development. Students resent that, but as teachers, we don't have the luxury to immerse in such feelings because every year something happens. The only year that nothing happened in it was in 2020, And you know all what happened in 2020. We had COVID, so of course, nothing happened. So when we talk about the trauma and mental health, in 2008, I was working in an afternoon shift in Maghazi camp, and it was times of exams. So I remember I was holding exam papers to deliver it and distribute it to students. And suddenly, an explosion happened. School started shaking violently. Students started crying, a few fainted. I remember I started shouting at them to stay in the middle of the class because in my mind that seems the safest thing to do. I remember I looked to the right side windows and I saw flame and smoke. So I started shouting at the students to go to the left side of the class. When a student shouted and pointed to the left side, and I looked there and I saw a thick black smoke. And that is the moment when I knew that something horrible and horrendous had happened. Another teacher and I tried to keep students in the school, but it was total chaos. It was the first time that something like that happened, and students were grouping, running together, families coming to pick their daughters, and I had a cousin in my school, and I tried to keep her with me, but she was crying because she was worried about her younger brother, her 12 years brother, and she went searching for him. There was no reception. We didn't know what was happening, actually. And that day was one of the saddest and the bloodiest days in Gaza's history. So after that, schools, of course, when you think about it, is still in many Palestinians' eyes is a safe place, it's a shelter. According to UNRWA, many Gazans, or many displaced Gazans, lived in UNRWA schools, which was utilized as centers, as shelters during 2014 conflict. But being shelters for many Palestinian families does not mean that the schools are at not high risk of destruction. According to OCHA, 1,047 students and teachers have been killed during 2014 conflict. And according to the Ministry of Education and Higher Education, 46 public schools have been damaged by direct or indirect bombardment during the last aggression, May 2021. So, what does that leave us with? For me, every day I wonder if the same thing will happen again. Would I be able to do the same? Would I be able to help my students to evacuate? Would be able to evacuate in time? What if a student fainted? Can I carry her or not? What about my kids, my sons? What if their teacher left them behind and now they are crying, waiting for me? What will happen to them? Should I go to them first? And this train of dark thoughts, which is common between most females or women in Gaza Strip, keeps going on, and you keep thinking. There are many times while teaching a lesson on writing grammar, for example, in the blackboard, and we will hear airstrikes hitting something or an explosion. My students will get so worried and they're scared. And I will tell them, please continue writing what's on the blackboard. We don't have time. And many other times, we will hear the loud voice of drones. It would be very loud. And my students will turn yellow, and pale. And they will literally close their books. And I will look at them and say, what's wrong? Is there something wrong? Please open your books and continue writing, because it is not something that happens once a month, once a year. It is our daily life, and we have to adapt with that. And sometimes you can adapt or not. I have once a brilliant student who will always start crying when she hears shooting, and then the rest of the class will start crying too. So what happens is, when I hear shooting, I will ask her to leave the class, to go wash your face, do whatever you want, to teach the rest of the class. And at that moment, I would be so ashamed of myself. But I'm thinking about teaching the rest of the class. And many times I would sit with my colleagues in our teacher's room, and usually our teacher's room are the teachers from all subjects. And we discuss how many nights we woke up at the sound of bombardment, and we spend the rest of the night trying to soothe our children and make them go to sleep again. And next day, early morning, I'm talking about 6 a.m., we go to our schools to teach, to motivate, while we are trying to find excuse to stay home. There are many words that trigger us. I have a colleague, she's a marvelous teacher. She will get in a panic attack if she had the word invade or يقتحم in Arabic. I don't watch news, I can't watch news. I will enter a very period time of depression, and I don't want that. So there is too much pressure for teachers to be positive all the time. We have become great actors in hiding our feelings for the sake of our families, for the sake of our children, for the sake of our students. We cannot say that we are tired or exhausted or even scared. A friend of mine just wrote yesterday that in Gaza, you have all the reasons to collapse, but you don't have the luxury to collapse. So this is another photo of schools that we have, which has been damaged, and we have thousands of these photos. So I would like to ask you a question. How many of you feel that they are receiving a value salary? Can you raise your hands, please? Okay. So I think IATEFL should make a session about salaries and how much they appreciate teachers. Okay, so how many of you feel that they are getting paid enough according to the work that they do? Okay, good number. So can you imagine that in Gaza, we are receiving 40 to 60% of our salaries? And it has been for several years. At the beginning, it was 40% of our salaries every 60 or 50 days. But nowadays, we are having 60% of our salaries every 30 days. So, ladies and gentlemen, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, it's far, far away. We can barely see it, but at least we have light. So, by that, can you imagine that teachers, or some of them, let's say, are way under poverty line? Most of the teachers try to search for jobs after finishing schools, for example, giving private lessons, working as a taxi driver, working as a shop assistant in a restaurant. And that includes me, because I work as an English trainer after finishing school. And not only that, but many of the teachers don't have even enough money for transportation. They walk long distances to reach their schools. And you can imagine how tired they will be when they reach schools. And not only that, but when you hear that the Ministry of Social Development say that 92% of employees in Gaza suffer from depression and deep sadness because of their inability to give their children allowance. And after that, you will start thinking that's normal because Gaza have, as Asmaa said, a huge numbers of poverty and huge rates. And these huge rates, of course, will affect education. How? You will find increasing trends of dropout of students of school. Female students, as due to minor marriages, especially in the 10th and 11th grades. I even have a student in the 9th grade who is engaged. And of course, male students who drop school to help their families financially. And we have another kind of dropping out, which is seasonal dropping out. It's related to agriculture. For example, it is the season of olive picking, and for example, beer picking, especially in east of Khan Younis, and where students don't go to school. You will go to schools, you will find the schools are empty. And after the season of picking olives or beers, they go back to schools, and teachers have more pressure and have more workload to try to finish the curriculums. And of course, as I said, my school is in one of the most marginalized areas in Gaza Strip. The school itself, it was built by donations. The clinic, the mosque, the residential buildings are all built by donations from different countries. So you can imagine that these families living there were way under poverty line, so they cannot afford to bring smartphone or bring, for example, a tablet for their students. So if I give an assignment for my students and we try to use online teaching, we're trying to follow everyone around, we're trying to follow all the techniques. So when we use online teaching, you will find 2 to 3 maximum students who would answer that assignment. And also when you think about it in these areas, when you have families, usually have 6 to 7 children, even if they have one smartphone, how can they divide the time between their kids? So, in my point of view, I find, and I'm talking only about the area that I'm talking about, I found that education have caused, online teaching have caused inequality of teaching to the area that I'm teaching in. I once went to school, and after that went to the center that I'm teaching in as an English trainer. And after that, I went home and I started teaching my son. His name is Sulaiman. And I have to mention my other son because he will get mad if I didn't mention him. His name is Salim. I know mothers can relate to that. So I was teaching Sulaiman, and he kept looking at me saying, "Mom, you look so tired." And I will say, "Because I am tired." And he kept looking at me. You know, mothers know this look when they keep looking to us that way. And he said, "Mom, you look like a crushed snail." And I felt like a crushed snail. So here I am, a crushed snail English language teacher, trying to do a lot of things for my students in eastern of Gaza, with the little energy that I have, which keeps shifting with every bombardment, aggression, and escalation happens. Asmaa will continue with you now, talking about the rest. Thank you.
Thank you, Hasna. I think today talk is leaving us with so much questions. Unfortunately, we don't have answers for them. But we do have a passion to go with you in exploring how we all share the responsibilities of thinking about the future of education in areas of conflict. Hasna's talked about the undervalue of the work teaching. And I've seen many of you who has not raised their hand when the question was about equal salaries or even adequate salaries. And this is a problem that really needs to be brought to light, because with COVID, we have seen how education has shifted to the household. We've seen governments investing less in education. We've seen how the whole burden of education has been transferred to the household. We've seen how women who are responsible by social norms to perform the unpaid care and the domestic work, teaching their children, are the ones that doing all that kind of labor. And that leaves them feeling so inadequate the more the education, content, and tools are advancing compared to their knowledge. And that is something we need to talk about, we need to address. Part of the undervaluing of the teaching job is a feminist issue. It's a feminized job, and therefore it receives little attention and little valuation. And we need to bring that to light, because education is a fundamental thing. It's a fundamental foundation for building human societies. Without it, we will not go anywhere. And we need to bring that conversation to the forefront. But when we talk about the future of education, economic fragility is important. Economic fragilities in countries that is suffering from this fragility in conflict countries, but also in all of our countries. We need to look at how people coming from marginalized group, people suffering from intersectional disadvantages related to racism, to sexism, to ableism, all of this are experiencing education differently. And if we are not listening to those people, the future of education will leave so much generation behind, and we will be responsible for those future generations. We should be held accountable. And we also need to think about conflict and crisis when we think about the future of education. When we think about the technological tools that we are developing to bring education to every home, yet this technology could be used to track and hunt and bring so many people active in their communities down, and how this is affecting also other people, as Hasna mentioned, in areas where internet access is very limited, when government investment in education is very minimum. What does it mean, technology, to them? And how can we make that technology accessible, affordable, and how can we make it safe to them? And lastly, the question of mental health. What does it mean to be a teacher? We all have so many hats, and we are being a teacher who acts, particularly in conflict area, as a psychiatrist, as a support system, as a financial, even a provider, but also as a parent, and that obligation of being a parent, and like that fear, and as a human, because we tend to forget ourselves as a human, as individuals, when we are faced with all this multi-layered challenges. I want to leave us with a question of how the future of education will look like. How can we ensure that we have a decolonialized education system that value our indigenous knowledge, that value our knowledge, the way we are being taught, what our indigenous generation has been telling us, how we care for the environment, the languages that we use, and the content of the education, to what extent our content of the education is being extractive to ourselves and to the planet. It's a big responsibility, but I know that we all have that energy to go back home and see how can we take a little part in this responsibility toward a collective and hopefully a global solidarity to have a future for education that encompasses us all. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asmaa and Hasna. Thank you very much, IATEFL, This was a tough decision to make. I wouldn't say any more than that, but I am very grateful to the conference committee for going down this line and for bringing such wonderful speakers across to speak to us today. And I hope we will take the questions that Asmaa and Hasna have left us with back into our little corners and start working towards bringing positive change around in our environments.